This video is produced for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, investment, or legal advice. All facts are sourced from court records, SEC filings, DOJ press releases, and reputable news reporting. Trevor Milton was convicted of 3 federal crimes in October 2022, sentenced in December 2023, and subsequently pardoned by President Trump in February 2025. A pardon is not a finding of innocence. The historical and legal record of the verdict stands. The Busila Breakdown is an independent channel with no affiliation to any company, brand, or individual referenced in this video. Always do your own research before making financial decisions. In 2018, a company called Nikola released a video called Nikola One in Motion. In it, a massive semi-truck glides silently along a highway. No engine sound, no emissions, nothing but the hum of the road. The problem was, the truck couldn't move. The engine didn't work. The drivetrain didn't work. So the production crew drove the truck to the top of a hill, pointed it downhill, and filmed it rolling. That video was watched millions of times. It helped convince investors that Nikola was the next Tesla. At its peak, the company was worth $34 billion, more than Ford. This is the story of how a founder turned a truck that couldn't drive into one of the most expensive frauds in American corporate history, and how the justice system caught up with him right before the political system let him go. The electric vehicle boom of the late 2000s created a very specific problem for investors. Everyone wanted to be in the space, but Tesla had already locked up the passenger car story. The next frontier, people said, was heavy trucking. Semi-trucks are responsible for a staggering share of transportation emissions. They're also extremely expensive to operate. Diesel costs alone can run hundreds of thousands of dollars per year per vehicle. A company that could genuinely replace diesel semis with hydrogen fuel cells or electric powertrains would have an enormous addressable market. Trevor Milton understood that story perfectly. Milton founded Nikola Motor Company in 2014, naming it after the same inventor as Tesla, Nikola Tesla, which was either a branding masterstroke or a sign of what was coming, depending on who you ask. He positioned Nikola not as a manufacturer, but as a technology company, one whose hydrogen-powered trucks would make traditional diesel economics obsolete. The pitch worked. Nikola secured partnerships with CNH Industrial, the parent company of truck brand Iveco, and began negotiating with major fleet operators. In June 2020, Nikola went public through a merger with a special purpose acquisition company called VectoIQ. In those early weeks, the stock climbed fast enough that the company's market capitalization briefly exceeded $34 billion. To put that in perspective, General Motors, founded in 1908, was worth about $33 billion at the same moment. Nikola, which had delivered 0 trucks, was briefly worth more. Milton was now a billionaire on paper, and Wall Street was paying attention. Then, in September 2020, a company called Hindenburg Research published a report. Hindenburg Research is a short seller, a firm that bets against companies it believes are overvalued or fraudulent. When Hindenburg published its report on Nikola in September 2020, it was titled Nikola: How to Parlay an Ocean of Lies into a Partnership with the Largest Auto OEM in America. The report ran to 67 pages. It made dozens of specific claims, but the one that stuck was the truck. Hindenburg had tracked down the production details behind Nikola One in Motion, the video of the gliding semi-truck, that had become central to the company's promotional materials. Their finding: the truck had been placed at the top of a sloped road in the desert and filmed rolling downhill under gravity. At no point in the video was the truck actually powering itself. The camera angles were chosen to conceal this. Milton's immediate response was to deny it. He called the Hindenburg report false and defamatory and said the firm was trying to manipulate Nikola's stock price for profit. He accused the short sellers of coordinating the attack, but investigators didn't go away. The SEC opened an inquiry. The Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation, and over the following months, prosecutors built a case that went beyond the truck video. The DOJ alleged that Milton had made repeated false statements to investors, not just once, not just about one product, but systematically across media appearances, podcast interviews, and direct investor communications. He told investors Nikola had produced its own hydrogen. It hadn't. The company had purchased it commercially. He overstated the company's battery technology capabilities. He claimed manufacturing partnerships were further along than they were. Milton resigned as executive chairman of Nikola in September 2020. The same month, the Hindenburg report dropped. The company he'd built was still standing. He, however, was not. Trevor Milton was indicted in July 2021 on 4 federal counts: 1 count of wire fraud and 3 counts of securities fraud. The indictment laid out what prosecutors called a fraudulent scheme running from November 2019 through September 2020, the exact window when Milton was most aggressively promoting Nikola in public. The government's theory was that Milton knew the technology was not what he was claiming, and that he made false statements specifically to inflate the stock price and enrich himself. The trial began in October 2022 in the Southern District of New York. Prosecutors presented evidence of Milton's media strategy, a long list of public statements across mainstream outlets, podcasts, and investor calls, each mapped against what internal documents and engineers said was actually true at the time. The gap between the two was the government's case. The defense argued that Milton was an optimistic founder who sometimes overstated progress, but that there was a difference between aggressive salesmanship and criminal fraud. They pointed to the complexity of early-stage technology development and argued that Milton genuinely believed the company could get there. The jury deliberated and returned its verdict on October 14, 2022. Guilty on 3 counts: wire fraud and 2 counts of securities fraud. Not guilty on a single remaining securities fraud count related to retail investors specifically. In December 2023, U.S. District Judge Edgardo Ramos sentenced Trevor Milton to 4 years in federal prison. The judge also ordered restitution for investors who had lost money during the period when Milton was making the statements prosecutors called fraudulent. Meanwhile, Nikola, the company itself, had settled with the SEC in December 2021 for $125 million over related disclosure violations. In February 2025, just as Milton was preparing to report to prison, Nikola Motor Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The company that had briefly been worth more than Ford no longer existed as a going concern. On February 11, 2025, President Donald Trump signed a pardon for Trevor Milton. Milton was one of several white-collar defendants who received clemency in that period. The pardon was a full executive pardon. It wiped out Milton's criminal convictions and meant he would not serve the 4-year sentence. Here is what a pardon does and doesn't do. A presidential pardon eliminates the legal consequences of a criminal conviction. Milton would not go to prison. He would not owe the government what would otherwise be required under the court's restitution framework. He was free. What a pardon does not do is change the historical record. The jury found him guilty. The judge sentenced him. Those proceedings happened. The verdict stands in the historical and legal record, and the factual basis for the conviction, the statements he made, the evidence prosecutors presented, the jury's conclusions, is not erased by the pardon. For investors who lost money while Milton was pitching his downhill rolling truck as a working vehicle, the pardon meant that the legal mechanism for recovering their losses through the criminal case was gone. Reports at the time of the pardon noted that Milton and entities associated with him had contributed approximately $1.8 million to committees and PICs aligned with Trump during the 2024 election cycle. Trump administration officials pushed back on the suggestion that the pardon and the donations were connected. There's a pattern here worth naming. The United States has a long history of wealthy defendants navigating the justice system differently than everyone else. The Nikola case, from the ETHPAC boom that inflated the valuation, to the social media promotional blitz, to the pardon that ended the sentence before it began, is a reasonably complete picture of how that pattern works in practice. The Nikola story runs almost exactly from 2019 to 2025. 6 years. A truck that couldn't move. A stock that briefly made Trevor Milton richer than most people will ever comprehend. A federal conviction and a presidential pardon. Here's what I keep thinking about when I look at this one. The Hindenburg Report came out in September 2020. By that point, Nikola had already been public for 3 months. $34 billion of market capitalization had already been created on the basis of products that didn't yet exist, with a promotional strategy that a jury later concluded crossed into criminal fraud. The short sellers found it. Journalists found it. Regulators found it, eventually. But by the time any of that happened, the damage was done. The valuation was set. The stock had been sold. The winner in that sequence was not the investor. The lesson isn't that SPACs are inherently fraudulent or that ambitious technology startups shouldn't be allowed to go public early. The lesson is simpler than that. When a company's public story is built almost entirely on a founder's promises about future technology with no independent verification and no working product you can actually see, that's not an investment thesis. That's a bet on whether someone is telling you the truth. Trevor Milton wasn't. I'm Andrew Busila. This is the Busila Breakdown.